I attend conferences like this around the world, and by and large, when I encounter the business communities of Europe or of Asia, they tend to see the trade war and the worsening relationship between China and the United States as Donald Trump's fault. He's the wrecking ball, smashing the liberal international order, and Xi Jinping is the good guy who goes to Davos and defends the international liberal order. But I think this is, in fact, a misunderstanding, and I'm going to try and clear it up. You know, China has achieved, as we all know, the most spectacular industrial revolution and economic rise in all of economic history. Just think, back in 1996, China's gross domestic product in dollar terms was just 10% of that of the United States. And in 2014, it passed the 60% mark in current dollar terms. On a purchasing power parity adjusted basis, it actually overtook the United States. But the question is, how was this done, by fair means or foul? And the answer is that there were quite a lot of foul as well as fair means in there. Intellectual property theft on a massive scale, espionage and sustained cyber warfare against Western companies, a bending, if not outright breaking, of World Trade Organization rules, currency manipulation to prevent the RMB from appreciating, and the exclusion, systematic exclusion of Western companies from the Chinese market via tariffs, as well as non-tariff barriers. Fact, at the beginning, before the trade war began last year, Chinese average tariffs on US imports were around 8%, compared with just 3.1% average US tariffs on Chinese imports. Oh, and don't forget, while all of this has been happening over the last 20 or so years, the median household in the United States, and indeed in most of the developed world, has been stagnating in terms of real income. The median household in the United States is barely better off than it was in 1999. And the only surprising thing, ladies and gentlemen, is that it took this long for the backlash against China to happen. The only thing I couldn't figure out was why it had taken so long for this backlash even to begin. The US response, which is often criticized because it's easy to criticize Donald Trump with his flamboyant personality and disrespect for nearly all social and political conventions, has not, in my view, been disproportionate. The US has used tariffs much as the Nixon administration used them against Japan in the 1970s. It has raised tariffs substantially against Chinese imports and also against other trade competitors, with a view to resetting the international trade order in a way that is fair and no longer advantages China at the expense of everybody else. The US is also applying pressure on Chinese technology companies like Huawei, whose rapid and state-subsidized expansion clearly poses a threat to the security of the countries that adopt its technology, because Huawei is manifestly a government company, and anybody who thinks that the Chinese government doesn't have access to the data that Chinese technology companies acquire is living in la-la land. Let me conclude very briefly. We are seeing an escalation from a trade war to a tech war to something that increasingly resembles a Cold War. And I've gone so far as to say we are already in Cold War II. And I would have thought there are a few places in the world that would be more scared of Cold War II than this country, than South Korea, bearing in mind what happened on the Korean Peninsula right at the beginning of Cold War I. But I have good news for you. This Cold War is not going to involve proxy wars in what we used to call the Third World, nor is it going to involve nuclear brinkmanship. Do not fear Cold War II. Accept its necessity, because the alternative is a world that by 2030 or thereabouts would otherwise be dominated by a one-party state inimical to the rule of law and to individual freedom, the human rights abuses of which are increasingly the greatest scandal in our world today. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Niall Ferguson there saying, do not fear Cold War 2.0. Xi Jinping may have casted himself as a globalist on the world stage, but has been leading a country engaging in protectionist practices that have fueled the rise of China. As for Trump's trade war, it is a much needed reset, he says, for fair trade. Now, let's give it for Justin Ifulin. Justin.
Trade is a win-win for every country. And even U.S. has a large trade deficit with China. But it's because, on the one hand, China's competitive advantages and the US competitive advantages are different. China currently has a per capita GDP of about 10,000 US dollars. US per capita GDP last year was $62,000. China specializes in more labor-intensive, low value-added products. US specializes in high value-added products. Because of the difference in the competitive advantages, US has been importing labor-intensive products, low-value products, from East Asia. Although now, China contributes about 50% to the US trade deficit. But if you look historically, US trade deficit with East Asian economies has been the major sources of the US trade deficit. In the 1980s, the East Asians contributes to more than 80% to the US trade deficit. But the trade deficit of US with East Asian economy has declined from over 80% in the 1980s, now down to only about 60%. So China was not the main reason for the US problems. We know that when we talk about trade, we should not look at the bilateral trade. We should look at the overall trade. The main reason for the US trade deficit to increase substantially in quantity, it is because of its internal structural problems. We know that US consumes a lot, US saves a little, and any country with that kind of structure, they are going to have trade deficit. And the increasing trade deficit in the US cannot solved by trying to imposing tariff rate or other measure. For example, since came into power of the Trump administrations, and US tried to impose tariff rate on China, on Korea, on Japan, on European countries. But last year, US trade deficit increased 12.1%. In spite of all those measures, in the name of trying to reduce trade deficit, but actually, US trade deficit increased. And also, US trade deficit in China also increased, 11.7%. So that means, actually, US is fighting a wrong enemy. And Neil mentioned about there's a lot of accusation on China, but those are just accusations. Do you have any real cases to support that? For example, intellectual property rights. Well, China also, learned from the advanced country to, adopt a very sophisticated intellectual property right regime. And if there's a violation, you can go to the court. And I'd like to mention, 84% of the foreign companies suing the Chinese company in violation of the intellectual property right. the foreign companies won the case. And I'd like to mention, in the US, less than 50% of the foreign companies, when they sued the US companies, they won the case. So on this record, I don't know which country has a better record. And a violation of WTO rules, well, certainly, according to the WTO General Secretary, he mentioned China should be considered as a student of A, although not A+. And China certainly, in the past 16 years, was sued for about 40 times. And China won most cases. And if China loses the cases, China follows the ruling. And in the same periods, US was sued more than 80 times, but US never followed the ruling.
At the core of this discussion is also an issue of trust. With the rise of China, can South Korea trust China? On the issue of the Made in China 2025 industrial-led policy to turn China into a high-tech superpower, an interesting finding from, again, the US-China Business Council survey. And it said this, quote, when asked companies about Made in China 2025, quote, the number of American companies indicating that MIC 2025 offered positive opportunities for their business in 2019 has nearly doubled since 2018. You have American companies in this survey saying that they believe Made in China 2025 is not a threat, but an opportunity for them. And I just wanted to get your thoughts, because we have a number of South Korean business representatives, head of companies here in this audience, and they're wondering, should we trust China as we move forward? How do you respond to something like this?
Look, the pattern is extremely clear. China has raced up the value chain with extraordinary speed. It seems like 10 years ago I was teaching at Harvard Business School, and it seemed like my colleagues and many students thought that China was essentially in the apparel business, in cheap clothing and cheap footwear. But when you looked at the data, China was racing up electrical engineering, it was racing up the machine tool industry, and now it's racing up the microprocessor business. Now it's racing up the smartphone business. And I think one has to recognize that there's a pattern here. China is rapidly catching up with South Korea, with Taiwan, with other Asian tiger economies. And as I've mentioned, it's not doing that entirely fairly. South Korea has broadly played by the rules of the international system. South Korea has been one of the most extraordinary success stories of a liberal international order. Not only economically, it's certainly the great economic miracle of the post-Korean War era, but also politically, because South Korea managed the transition from authoritarianism to democracy. And that's no trivial thing. It's one of the great achievements of this country's history. Now, there was a time when people in the United States told themselves that something similar would happen in China too. And that as China rose up the economic value chain, so it would rise up the political value chain. That it would gradually transition to a more open society where there would be individual liberties, free speech, and ultimately perhaps even democracy. It turns out that that was a complete fantasy. The direction of travel since Xi Jinping came to power has been exactly the opposite one. I see this on university campuses, and Justin, I won't embarrass you by asking you to comment, but it's palpable at universities such as Tsinghua, your Beijing rival, that the chill has descended, that the ideological character of the regime is becoming more and not less explicit, and the prospect of any kind of liberalization has largely vanished, to the great disappointment of many of my Chinese friends in academia and in business. So this is the thing to bear in mind. This is not just a story about economics. It is not simply a matter of comparative advantage. It is a matter of a fundamental difference in systems between a system in which there is no real rule of law and only one party rules, a system in which individual rights are subordinate to the party, and ethnic minorities can be imprisoned en masse and subjected to indoctrination because their religion and tradition no longer are compatible with the party's outlook. On the other side, the system that South Korea embraced, Justin speaks of China as if it never did an aggressive thing in its history. Tell that, Justin, to the Tibetans. Tell that to the Uyghur population. Tell that to the Vietnamese. Explain to me what is happening in the South China Sea, and explain to me why it is that China continues to prop up the most totalitarian regime, the least liberal regime on the planet, that of North Korea, a regime which poses a clear threat to the lives of the people in this region and indeed further afield. Let's not pretend, ladies and gentlemen, that this is just about economics, because it's much, much more important than that. It's about the viability of democracy in East Asia. And as the great beacon of successful democratization, South Korea should be very nervous indeed, not just about Made in China 2025, but about the whole strategy that Xi Jinping is pursuing, which is to make a fundamentally totalitarian system dominant in the Asia-Pacific region.
One thing difference between China and the country you described. Yes, our system looks somewhat different from yours.
Somewhat different.
But we
Is
have the same
putting it
purpose.
mildly.
We have the same purpose. We will try to improve the well-being of the people. That's one thing. And secondly, our system may be different from yours in its arrangement and so on. But we never try to ask other countries to adopt our system. And your country, starting from the UK, and now you are citizen of the US, always ask other countries to adopt your political system. But look at what is the result in Africa, in Europe, in former Soviet unions. Is that what you want other countries to have? To have their collapse of the economy, to cause in their political system to be captured by oligarchs. I would also not to have that.
The trajectory of history, ladies and gentlemen, has just been comprehensively misrepresented. And it's absurd to hear it done in South Korea, a country that American soldiers gave their lives to preserve as a free country, not under the thrall of communism. And it was that sacrifice in the Korean War that ultimately made possible South Korea's economic miracle, and ultimately made possible its political miracle. So let us not misrepresent the contribution that the United States has made. All over the world, since the 1940s, democracy has gained and authoritarianism has receded. That is the great trend, the arc of history, if you will, since the United States became the dominant power in the world. And the principal obstacle to the advance of human freedom has been communist regimes. In some cases, happily, those regimes have collapsed. I remember now what it was like in 1989 when my friends in Eastern Europe first tasted freedom. Remember what happened 30 years ago in China. Let's never forget the victims of Tiananmen Square. And let's ask ourselves, when will there be another Tiananmen Square? Will it be, Christy, in Hong Kong, where you live and work, where brave protesters are defying the increasing oppressive power of the regime in Beijing? That's the question I would ask. So while we began by talking about economics and focused on trade, let's not lose sight of what matters most in life. Economic success ultimately is based on individual freedom. China's miracle came about because Deng Xiaoping realized that the Stalinist model of state control was no longer viable and allowed people in the villages and later in towns to engage in the entrepreneurship that Mao Zedong had prohibited and indeed punished with death. That individual freedom is the thing that I certainly most cherish. And what I fear about Xi Jinping's project for China is that it is fundamentally inimical to the spirit of freedom, and it aspires to increase the power of the party, not over ordinary Chinese citizens, but further afield. And it's the expansionist urge of Xi's regime that should most trouble us. An expansion not only over sea and over land with the One Belt, One Road project, but an expansion in cyberspace and indeed in space itself. How many of us today are, unbeknownst to us, under the surveillance of Chinese technology companies and therefore the Chinese state? Do we really want to be subordinate to a government that spends more on surveillance of its own citizens than it does on national defense? Which science fiction dystopia do we want to live in? Will it be 1984 or Brave New World? Or is there some way in which we can push back against the inexorable rise of a one-party state and remind people in countries like South Korea, all over this region, in Africa, in Latin America, that there is a fundamental choice to be made. It is a choice between a democratic system where the rule of law is uppermost and where economic activity takes place in a free market with free actors, both free politically and free economically. Or do we want the influence to rise inexorably of a system that we thought was on its last legs back in 1989, but to my dismay has made a comeback in China? That's the choice that we face.
Okay, and ladies and gentlemen, I'm also keeping an eye on the clock, and what started as a trade war debate has turned into a clash of ideals and ideology, very fascinating to listen to. I did promise that we would get in a few Slido questions. There were a number of questions on the list. A couple of them got my attention earlier. One was concerned about what is the economy going to look like going forward in this next year? And then we'll end with the other question, which was, how do you go from trade war to trade peace? First, your economic forecast. What should we look forward to or brace ourselves for?
See all forecasts about US, about Europe, they are just downward. Certainly, China also faces some kind of downward pressures, both because of uncertainties caused by the trade conflicts, and also China now is the largest trading country in the world. When the outside world slowing down, certainly it also affects China. And also because Chinese government want to clean the domestic house. So we adopt certain kind of structural reform. And as you know, structural reform is always some kind of contractionary. And all those forces causing the Chinese economy to slow down somewhat. But I'm confident China will be able to grow about 6% because China still have a large domestic space for investment, for industrial upgrading, for further improving the environment, and for urbanizations. And China also has sufficient resources for making investment, both from fiscal space, from high savings, and from abundant foreign reserves. And with that, I think China will be able to grow at 6% and above. Currently, China's weight in the world is about 16%. So that means China will continue to contribute 1 percentage point to the global growth. And that will be around 30% of the global growth. And that will benefit China, but will be a big opportunity for Korea, for other countries with good trading relations with China.
Christy, the Chinese growth rate will be whatever the Chinese government says it is. The question is what the real growth rate will be, and it almost seems certain to decline, and decline rapidly in the coming years for demographic reasons, and also because China's reached the limits of what it can do with leverage. It's reaching the limits of what it can do with monetary policy. It's going to devalue. I imagine the currency will weaken further, but the real growth rate is going to be substantially below what the Chinese government says when it aims at around 6%. I think you should probably assume it's quite a bit below that. Look, predictions of the US entering recession have been all the rage just lately. People have got very excited about inverted yield curves. I don't think there's going to be a recession in the United States, though I don't think that the US economy is going to grow much faster than 2% next year. It's clearly going to be slower than it was. But that is not reason for an anxiety attack. My own view is that if one looks at the predictions of doom and gloom that economists made about the Trump administration, not least my old adversary, Paul Krugman, on election night back in November 2016. You may remember that Professor Krugman predicted that night that the stock market would never recover from Donald Trump's election. It had recovered by 11:30 a.m. the same day that he made that prediction, and it has gone on to outperform the Chinese stock market and indeed pretty much every other stock market. Look, we've had conversations about the rise in the past of the Soviet Union. Paul Samuelson's textbook, the most standard textbook in macro, used to predict that the Soviet Union would overtake the United States in various years that constantly had to be changed because it never happened. Then there was Paul Kennedy's prediction that Japan would overtake the United States, or would it be West Germany? And here we are having the same kind of conversation about China. Folks, I think we should have learned by now from history that it's pretty hard to overhaul the United States. China's going to be in the middle income trap. Its growth is going to decline rapidly because of its demographic headwind, a self-inflicted problem owing to the one-child policy. And the United States is going to surprise massively to the upside, as a free society will always outdo an authoritarian one. So my prediction, not just for next year, but for the next 10 years, is that you should be long the United States and short the People's Republic of China.
It's hard to overhaul the United States. It's hard to overhaul Chimerica in this very tangled relationship, which leads us to our final question that was submitted anonymously through the app.
I have a response.
You do want to respond. Go ahead.
Now, do you really believe in what you said?
I do, and I think
Okay,
one of the great
if you believe,
the
we can
great
have a
surprise,
bet. We can have a bet.
I'm happy to make a bet with you.
Okay. $2 million US
It's a,
in 20 years.
it's a sign-
China will overtake US.
it's a
$2
sign.
million US.
If there's a,
Among everyone here, what,
let
if you
me-
can,
let-
you can up that.
Okay,
Well,
we're
let-
going to have to
let me-
meet again in
let
20
me make
years.
it clear that I certainly can't afford to bet $2 million, Justin. And if you can, I hate to think how you made that money. It certainly wasn't by being a professor. But I'll certainly bet you 2,000 of the Chinese currency, which
I want to borrow money to bet because I trust what I said.
I wish I could borrow $2 million. There isn't a bank in the United States that would lend me that money. So let me just suggest that we bet in your currency, Justin, which I'm sure
in
meets the
20
bet.
years, China will overtake US.
I'll bet you that doesn't happen, Justin. And I'll bet you, let's split the difference. 200,000 RMB that doesn't happen.
Okay,
200,000
take it.
RMB. There we go.
In 20 years,